So my message today is curiosity and judgment. But basically, it's tied to one of our shared Unitarian Universalist principles, pluralism, and that's essentially what I want to talk about today. Just to refresh you all, these value statement that we all agreed to via General Assembly a few years back says this: we celebrate that we are all sacred beings, diverse in culture, experience, and theology. We covenant to learn from one another in our free and responsible search for truth and meaning, and we embrace our differences and commonalities with love, curiosity, and respect. It's a beautiful statement, but frankly, I think it's one of the most difficult of our shared values. Because the greater the difference between two people, the harder it is to live into that value. It's relatively easy to embrace difference when there's differences that are small, or maybe they're even interesting or enriching. But it's much harder, much harder when the differences strike us deep at our fears, maybe our identities, our politics, our wounds, or even our sense of morality. So the last time I spoke with you, remember it was curiosity didn't kill the cat? I reflected on curiosity as a spiritual practice. It's a discipline of openness. Real curiosity requires humility. It requires vulnerability. It means we must remain open to answers we do not expect and perspectives, frankly, that we might not even like. And that, of course, can be very, very unsettling. So, referring back to Valerie Kaur, in her book, See No Stranger, she uses a different word for the same spiritual posture. She calls it wonder instead of curiosity. And she says, you are a part of me I do not yet know. So she very much takes it internally. What a profound spiritual challenge. Kaur says wonder is the wellspring of love. So therefore, if you follow along, if wonder or curiosity is the wellspring of love, then curiosity is not optional for those who want to live love-centered lives, which is the core of Unitarian Universalism. So like water from a spring, curiosity then keeps the water flowing. Without curiosity, love stagnates. Without curiosity, assumptions harden into judgments, and other people become caricatures instead of human beings. And so frankly, then, our calling is not merely to love in theory. Like, I think it's easy for all of us to come to these great services like this where we know everybody and we talk about that love-centered lives is important. And I'm with you. Sometimes I can go, yep, I love everybody. I can check that box. Let's go to the final hymn and go have coffee, okay? It's not just theoretical. It's our calling to do the spiritual work necessary to allow love to flow freely, to remove the obstacles that block it. And that's what I want to talk about today. I think the biggest obstacle is judgment. So I sat and thought about this. And I think I kind of turned it into three levels, at least from my personal experience, three levels of judgment, and each have different degrees of difficulty and complexity. So the first one I just called the inner circle. The second one is the stranger. And the third one is the antagonist. So the inner circle, of course, is the easiest place to practice pluralism. Consider this congregation as the example. Most of us probably share certain broad values. We likely have overlapping educational experiences or political leanings and or social concerns. And even when we differ, we often differ within this framework of mutual respect. And this congregation already practices curiosity well. We invite people from the congregation with different spiritual journeys into the pulpit. We explore different traditions. We ask questions. We're good at asking questions. We listen. And yet, over the years, within Unitarian Universalism, I'm new to this congregation, so I don't know really how it's impacted it here, but at the movement in a total, there have been a lot of dichotomies that have caused a lot of friction over the years. And when I say them, they're going to be obvious to you probably. The rational versus the emotional thinker, right? The head versus the heart, if you will. The metaphorical and the literal. The scientific and the mystical. The theist and the non-theist. That one was a big one in the 20th century. Some hear religious language poetically. Others hear it spiritually. Some reject supernaturalism entirely, and others experience mystery that's deep and personal. And somehow, imperfectly but sincerely, we try to remain in covenant with one another. In recent weeks, and I think that's because of things happening in the society at large, I've had a lot of groups that have come up with a subject I didn't expect to be talking much about in Unitarian Universalist congregations, and that's UFOs. Or as they are now called, UAPs, thank you, which is unidentified aerial phenomenon. So in recent years, and very recently, the government agencies have released files and testimony that have reignited public fascination with the possibility of extraterrestrial life. Now, imagine, I've been in these small groups and one-on-ones here at my congregations, both of them, and it's a very interesting conversation, and I'm right in the middle of this. I'm not just the observer here. So you have one person that is convinced intelligent life exists elsewhere in the universe. Okay? Then you have another that thinks all UFO reports are explainable through psychology or atmospheric science. And then you've got another wonders about the spiritual implications of all of this. And then another is simply curious about mystery. You have all that in the same room. And then a judgmental conversation, I've heard sometimes. We won't name names. You can say, well, how can anyone believe in that nonsense? And then you can get the reverse. And someone will say, well, how can people be so closed-minded, right? But a curious conversation sounds different. It's something like, what experiences led you to think that? Or what meaning does this hold for you? Or what do you think humanity longs for in these stories? What's the meaning of these stories that we're hearing? Curiosity does not demand agreement. Curiosity merely asks to seek understanding. And in communities like this one, that kind of openness allows pluralism to thrive. And we should be very, very proud of that. But then we move outward in sort of these concentric circles, from the inner circle to the stranger, and it gets a little bit harder. Because strangers are often interpreted through first impressions. We see someone for 10 seconds and our minds instantly construct a story. I do that all the time. One of my favorite activities is to sit by the window in a coffee shop and make up stories about who's walking by. So be careful. So the writer and artist Jem Pasecki tells a story in an essay called When You Want to Judge, Be Curious Instead. And it's part of this month's Soul Matters packet. If you happen to look at that, I highly recommend you click on the link and read her essay. But I'm going to tell you about it anyway. She describes encountering someone whose behavior irritated her. It involved a mother and her children in a library story hour. Instead of participating with her children, she was sitting over in the corner on her phone. Can you believe it? And immediately, Jen's mind began forming really harsh judgments about that person's character and motives. But then she stopped herself. Instead of assuming the worst, she said, I'm going to be curious. I'm going to think of other things other than neglecting your children, right? So she became curious and came up with, well, maybe she's just overwhelmed. Maybe she's received terrible news and she's trying to see what's going on with it. Maybe she's just plain exhausted, needed a break, and somebody else is watching her kids for the moment. And maybe they're carrying burdens that were invisible to her. And then she realized something really important. Judging the person would have left her angry, irritated, and self-righteous. But curiosity opened up another possibility: compassion. She writes that there's something freeing about giving someone the benefit of the doubt and imagining possibilities beyond assumptions. And then she concludes with this really cool and powerful reminder. She says, judgments are assumptions, not truths. Judgments are assumptions, not truths. That line matters. Judgments feel true, but often they're stories we invent from incomplete information, and then curiosity interrupts these stories. There's more common examples that she offers in the article, and you'll know these. Someone cuts you off in traffic. A cashier seems really unfriendly, or a neighbor seems particularly rude to you. Our first instinct is often a moral interpretation. They're selfish. They're so inconsiderate. They're so rude all the time. But curiosity would ask, what might I not know about this? Curiosity, now I have to make a point here. Curiosity does not mean tolerating abuse or pretending harmful behavior is acceptable. It simply means resisting the temptation to collapse another human being into a single negative interpretation. So that's the stranger. Now the antagonist, the hardest category of all. These are not strangers we pass by briefly. These are people we encounter repeatedly who evoke frustration or anger or fear, or hopefully not, but sometimes pain. They're family members, they're neighbors, they're co-workers, they're people in civic groups that you happen to be in, they're people at school board meetings, they're people at the holiday dinners. They're the people who make us think things instantly like, how on earth can they believe that? Or how can they be so uninformed? Or so narrow-minded, or selfish, or hateful? Just fill in the blank, right? And to be fair, sometimes the beliefs or behaviors involved truly are harmful. So let's make that important distinction. Understanding is not the same thing as excusing. Explaining is not the same thing as endorsing. Curiosity does not require surrendering your moral convictions. It does not require reconciliation. It does not require placing yourself in an unsafe situation. And it's also important to acknowledge something else. Think about it. Curiosity itself can be a privilege. To remain open and vulnerable often means you're not overwhelmed by fear every moment of your life. Fear narrows people. It hardens people. It pushes people towards certainty and defensiveness. And many antagonistic attitudes are rooted, at least partially, in fear. Fear of change, fear of displacement, of losing status, of cultural unfamiliarity, of economic insecurity, or just fear of the unknown, frankly. I mean, think about it. Immigration's the big one that's been in the news for months and months and a couple of years now. And I encounter this all the time. People who hear about immigrants from Latin America and react with fear. And we all know that some of these fears are manipulated politically. Some are based on misinformation, and some or many are part of prejudice and xenophobia. But yet underneath those reactions may also be anxieties about economic survival, social change, or cultural disorientation. And they just erupt with these crazy stories. You hear it also with transgender people. Some people react with compassion and openness, and I'm quite sure that's probably everybody in the room here, thankfully. But others react with so much confusion and fear or even hostility. Again, curiosity doesn't mean accepting harmful rhetoric or abandoning vulnerable people. But curiosity may ask, What fears are underneath that reaction? Where's that coming from? What experience should shape that person? What stories have they been told? And what pain maybe are they projecting? Sometimes when we listen deeply enough, we discover that beneath anger is grief. Beneath certainty is fear, and beneath hostility is confusion. And sometimes we do not discover that. Sometimes people remain rigid, defensive, or cruel. So I guess curiosity is not magic. You may never agree with the antagonist. I think many of you in this room have tried. You may never change them. That's usually a hopeless cause. But perhaps the goal isn't conversion. Perhaps the goal is simply remembering their humanity. And perhaps in choosing curiosity instead of contempt, we offer something increasingly rare in the world today: humility, vulnerability, presence, and care. We live in a culture that rewards outrage and certainty. Social media trains us to flatten people into categories, and politics trains us to see enemies instead of neighbors. News media profits from conflict. We can't forget that. But our faith calls us elsewhere. Our faith asks us to wonder. To quote the reading, to look upon the face of anyone or anything and say, "You are a part of me I do not know yet." That does not mean abandoning justice. It means grounding justice in love rather than dehumanization. Because once we stop wondering about one another, love begins to dry up. But even a small movement towards curiosity can reopen the wellspring. Things like a thoughtful question, a pause. That's a good one. A pause before you make that judgment. A willingness to listen. Again, I know you've tried. Just try it again. Or a moment of humility. Sometimes that small adjustment changes everything. Sometimes it softens another person. Often it softens us. Sometimes it simply keeps our hearts from hardening. And perhaps that's where pluralism truly begins. Not merely tolerating difference, not merely coexisting like the bumper sticker says, but choosing again and again to meet one another with curiosity instead of contempt, to seek understanding before judgment, and to protect that flow of love. That is the pluralism I think we are called to encourage. And that is the blessing of curiosity as a spiritual practice. Amen.